So a new YouGov poll sponsored by Yahoo has just dropped, and we see a major shift for Kamala Harris from July, when she was the presumptive-ish kind of nominee for Democratic Party, to post-debate. So this is a post-debate poll that was done between the 11th and 13th of September, so all post-debate. It is a large sample size with a very small margin of error, 2.3% margin of error. And in this poll, we see Kamala Harris is now at 50% of the vote compared to Donald Trump's 45 in a two-way race, whereas this number was tied 46 to 46 back in July. So we've seen this major change over time, giving Kamala Harris more of a bump, and especially a post-debate bump. Now, even though she has this bump, I want to go more into her favorability ratings, because I was watching James Carville yesterday on Bill Kristol's show, and he talked about a convention bump, and he's like, it doesn't necessarily have to be a horse race bump. It can be a bump in favorability and likability and trusting the candidate more on certain issues. So in this video, we're going to talk a little bit more about these bumps that we see post-debate, particularly where Kamala Harris was in July, where she is now as far as her favorability rating. Now, I know for many Republicans, they're going to say favorability doesn't mean anything, because back in 2022, they're like, that was the only thing that determined anything, and that the Republicans were going to just sweep the floor with the Democrats because of Biden's unfavorability rating. But the difference is Biden wasn't on the ballot back in 2022. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are on the ballot. So let's go ahead and look at Kamala Harris's favorability changes over time. So as we can see, overall, she has gone from a 40% favorability rating to a 49% favorability rating. Now, I don't have unfavorable, but this is above water. So in a day where almost every politician is below water, she is above water. Now, of men, this is a huge shift. She has gone from 36% favorability rating to 46, a 10% bump. Now, if we look at women, we see that the bump is 8%. It's not as big as men, but it's still pretty significant. Now, amongst white voters, we also see an 8% bump. So we see these momentous shifts happening with some very important groups for the Democrats to kind of peel off of the Republicans, especially male voters and white voters. That male number going up 10% and her being at 46. Donald Trump in the same one is at 49. If we look at that crosstab, that's definitely within the margin of error of that crosstab. This is an important number for Kamala Harris. All right, so when we look at Hispanic voters, we see a huge 13% jump from 38% to 51%. We're going to talk about why that is very important in a few minutes, but I mean, obviously, look at the number. You can just tell it is very important. In the next one, independents, we have 30 to 47%, a 17% shift. Registered voters, we see a shift. And with Biden voters, because a lot of people, when Kamala Harris was being talked about back in July, they didn't really know. They were still kind of in their wishy-washy, we need to have Biden for some reason. Those numbers have gone up by 12%. So you can see in all of these major groups, we are seeing these huge shifts, like that independent, 17% shift from 30% favorability to 47% favorability. That is huge in the same poll with the same margins of error. I mean, there was like 10 less respondents maybe in one compared to the other. So we're talking about almost mirrored polls, and you really do see these Democratic numbers go and rise. Now we'll go ahead and look at Donald Trump's numbers. Now I just wanted to bring Trump's numbers up just because they don't really show any movement. I just wanted to show you how little movement they have. I mean, after knowing a guy for 9 years and knowing what he's going to say, people's views on him are not really going to change. So let's go ahead and look at those numbers right now. So you can see with Donald Trump, overall, he's gone down 1%. No big one. With male voters, he's gone down 1%. With female voters, he's gone down 1%. And with white voters, he's essentially the same. Now, if we go to Hispanic voters, he's gone down 2%. Independent, he's gone down 2%. Registered voters, he's gone up 1%. Trump voters, he's gone down 1%. So he's lost 1% of his own. So you can see these Trump numbers just really don't change. There's not much of a difference because there's only so much you can say now to change people's opinions on Donald Trump. He is pretty much an open book at this point, whereas Kamala Harris was, until the debate, really, I mean, maybe some people will say the convention, but really the debate, she was kind of unknown. The debate was the point where she could be put on the spot on a lot of issues. She could have the crazy man next to her yelling and all that and see how she handled that. The debate was the turning point in this. So, a lot of times we hear about convention bumps, but I'm thinking in this case, the convention just rah-rah, hooray, cheerleading event, whereas the debate was something real. And even though people who watch it, I think, do it as a cheering event, it really did show how well Kamala Harris could handle the pressure. And these numbers have changed drastically for her. It's quite amazing. Now, of course, these favorability numbers actually do mean something to a certain extent. We'll get into that because now we're going to get into the crosstabs for the horse race. And this is where, especially that Hispanic number, we might start seeing some changes. So let's go ahead and look at the horse race crosstabs that we have here. So at registered voters, you can see that Kamala Harris and Donald Trump were tied at 46 back in July. And now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, Kamala Harris is now up 50 to 45. Now, the important thing to remember here is that this same poll 4 years ago, Joe Biden was up by 6%, 41 to 47. And I think this is actually more impressive a result because of the fact that Kamala Harris is at 50%. So the more and more you get at that 50% and over, the less wiggle room you have for other candidates. You've got people being more solidified. So this is an excellent number for Kamala Harris, even compared to Joe Biden 4 years ago. If we look at male voters, we don't see a huge change, but just enough change. We're only talking about changes in the margins, and those are going to matter the most. We see a 4% increase for Kamala Harris and a 2% decrease for Donald Trump. And we see now amongst male voters, we're talking about only a 3% gap, or we're talking about a 9% gap before. This doesn't look like much when you just see the swing, but when you look at that September number and you see that it's only 3% difference, that is huge. Now, the one number that people might have thought would change quite a bit, but really hasn't changed since July, are female voters. So you can see Kamala Harris has gone up by 2 and Donald Trump has gone down by 1, but essentially the numbers are basically the same. I mean, obviously they favor Kamala Harris, but there hasn't been much movement amongst female voters in this, and we're seeing this in a lot of the polls that are coming out now, that maybe female voters are not going to be the ones who change. It's going to be the ones that we don't expect to change, like the male voters. Now let's go into breaking down the age. Obviously 18 to 29 going into this, a lot of them were a little bit more skeptical about Kamala Harris because of Israel, Gaza, stuff like that, maybe issues regarding student loans and whatnot, but you can see that now, post-debate, she has a 10% jump, okay? This is huge. Rarely do you see somebody winning a demographic that's not race-related by 70% almost, and Kamala Harris is there with 18 to 29 voters. Also, with 30 to 44 voters, you do see her with a 4% increase, and Donald Trump with a 1% increase actually as well. So you don't see as much of this divergence like you did with the younger voters, but you are still seeing Kamala Harris now at 54%, a majority. That 50 and over percentage is so important. That's your win, right? These are good numbers for her. Now, if we see voters 45 to 64, we essentially see that not changed at all. Donald Trump only down by 1. Kamala Harris's numbers are the same. And if we look at 65 and older voters, we do see Kamala Harris with a 3% increase and Donald Trump with a 2% decrease, which is making it a little bit closer for Kamala Harris. Now, in many of the state polls, you'll see the 65 and older number just kind of all over the place. Like Kamala Harris will be winning in one, losing in the other, and even within certain states, you'll see the polls go all over. This is the number, the 65 and older number, that is just the most erratic number. Now, somebody in the comments said, well, voters who are 65 and older are less likely to change their mind. And that's not really true, because if somebody in the last election was, let's say, 62, and now they're 65, they're getting ready to get their Social Security benefits and all that, those types of issues are going to matter more to them than they did before. So you do see a lot of older voters even sometimes become more Democratic when you have that messaging of the Republicans are going to privatize Social Security. Honestly, that is a huge, huge issue for Democrats. They should be running on that, especially with these senior numbers shifting as we see them. Now, if we look at registered white voters, we see again Kamala Harris with a 3% increase and Donald Trump with a 2% drop. It's still a decent margin that we have here, 9%, but it's not 14%. So we are seeing those numbers come down a little. And let's just put it this way. If she's at 43% of white voters when it comes to the general election, game's done. Game, set, match. It's over. She's going to win the election. Now here we see black voters and we see them back to the margins that we expect. Now 82-10 seems pretty much spot on, about right. But there was a point where we were seeing some crazy number with black voters. So like that active vote poll that I don't know much about. They were showing like, Donald Trump was going to win 24% of black voters. No, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen at all. This YouGov poll is pretty much spot on what we should expect in the general election. Now we've come to Hispanic voters, and this is the number I really want to talk about because as you can see, there hasn't been much of a shift. So you can see she's gone from 48 to 50. She's increased by 2. Donald Trump has gone up as well, 42 to 44. So you can see both of their numbers have increased at the same rate. So we don't really see a change. However, in the number that we have right now, we see 6% that are undecided. Now, I mentioned that favorability rating of Kamala Harris earlier, and this shows that with her favorability rating amongst Hispanic voters, she has more of a likelihood to maybe gain that extra 6% and get her number up to 56 to 44. So going into trying to win those undecided voters amongst Hispanic voters, I think Kamala Harris having the high favorability rating that she does with Hispanic voters is, well, higher, I guess we should say, than Donald Trump. Donald Trump is in the 31% compared to Kamala Harris, where I say she was at 50%. I think that this is going to be significantly better for Kamala Harris. Now, if we look at the independents, this is where we see a huge shift. The last time this poll was done, it was 44-44, pretty much a split, just like the main poll overall. But now we see her with a huge lead, 38 to 52 over Donald Trump. Now, unfortunately, as I mentioned, we don't have ideology, so we don't know how moderates were. But this independent number is huge. Now, sometimes this can be fool's gold. If you look at exit polls in Florida, for example, look at the exit polls when the Republicans win statewide, and look at the independents and how much they vote for Democrats. Okay, it's not necessarily always going to be how you think, but this huge margin, a 14-point gap, this is big for the Democrats. I think when we're talking about a national poll. Now we're going to get into something that I have mentioned a few times in some of my other things, which is that I believe a lot of the Donald Trump vote is buoyed by people who didn't vote in the past. Like they didn't vote in 2020 or they didn't vote in 2022. Now let's look at 2020. 2020 had the highest turnout rate of any election pretty much in modern history. And that's because of COVID and opening up the ways in which people could vote, which a lot of those are still open today, thank God. But it was high nonetheless. Now in this situation here, there's only 2 reasons in 2020 why you might not vote. So the first reason why you might not vote is because you weren't old enough to vote, right? You weren't 18 years old yet and you just couldn't vote. Now, the other reason is that you just don't vote, right? You don't vote, you're maybe registered, you don't vote. And if you didn't vote in 2020, and you probably didn't vote in 2022, you're highly unlikely to vote in 2024. Now with the 2022 number, it's kind of iffy, but if you didn't vote in 2020 and you totally had the chance to do it, you're probably not going to vote in 2024. And of those people who didn't vote in 2020, Donald Trump is doing quite well with those voters, and those voters are factored into the overall numbers. And a lot of times that could be between 15 and 20% of the sample size. So what we're going to look at now are those who voted in 2022. So these are going to be maybe not your super voters, but very close to what your super voters would be. So let's look at those who did vote in 2022. As you can see, in July, Kamala Harris only had a 1% lead. Now she has an 8% lead. So if we look at those people who actually voted in the midterm elections, Kamala Harris is actually dominating them. And there's a very, very, very high likelihood that these people are actually going to turn out to vote on Election Day. Now, if we look at those who didn't vote in 2022, I mean, they just might be presidential election voters, but they didn't vote for whatever reason. You can see there has been a change more toward Donald Trump. So Kamala Harris has only seen a 2% bump, whereas Donald Trump has seen a 4% bump. But you can see the overall number, which is what I wanted to focus on, that Donald Trump has 48% of these people, while Kamala Harris only has 40%. So a lot of her vote is buoyed by these people who don't seem to have a reliable or maybe a consistent voting behavior record. So this means to me that this looks a lot better for Kamala Harris because it does include those non-voters who usually trend quite a bit towards Donald Trump. So we finally have come to a bridge that might be ready to cross. Now, a lot of us have seen this bridge for years. A lot of us have even approached it, but like the data hasn't really been there that we're like, we can't cross this bridge yet because Republicans were winning, and they still could, but we are coming to that point. Donald Trump on a lot of these issues, the economy, job creation, prices, most important issues for Americans, he's beating Kamala Harris in. But yet Kamala Harris is winning the election. Okay, this seems counterintuitive to what we think. The question we now have to ask ourselves, and this is the question we've all been asking ourselves for years, and we're like, how the hell are people still voting for Republicans? Have the Republicans finally been seen as being so crazy that they're now making themselves unelectable? I mean, you can only talk about eating pets and dogs and Jewish space lasers and child sex rings and pizza parlors for so long when the electorate finally turns on you and says, you know what, you're a little bit out. And this is where the debate might have actually had an impact because a lot of people might have just heard that Donald Trump is crazy because, you know, the average person's out there doing stuff in their yard, playing baseball with their kids, watching Dancing with the Stars or whatever. They have a life. They're not people into politics like many of you watching or myself. They don't know every little intricacy of an election. They're just like, Donald Trump, I'm a Republican, he helps business, I'm going to vote for him. He was on the debate stage and finally talked about eating pets. And that might have confirmed in a lot of people's mind, oh, wow, he really is a nut, right? And I think we've now started to come to that point where Republicans are becoming unelectable because of just this craziness that they have. Now, of course, the Republicans will take over the Senate this year because Democrats will lose Joe Manchin's seat, and as of right now, it looks like John Tester will lose as well. That seat is like the only one to me that I really care about. But I truly believe that if all 100 Senate seats were on the line, Democrats would win and would be in control of all the chambers of Congress, especially even a gerrymandered, favoring Republican House of Representatives. I think the Democrats have a good chance of winning. The Republicans have now become that crazy party. And now the question is, will they perpetually be on the losing side of at least presidential elections? And it's coming to the point that they might be. So I just wanted to throw that out there because I think that we finally have crossed that bridge, that we can say that, yes, Republicans riding this crazy train since Sarah Palin and since Michelle Bachmann have been riding this crazy train for a while, it's finally caught up to them. And that train, I think, is gone off the bridge, and we can see it in the water. So I think the Democrats might be positioning themselves as the sane, moral party, whereas the Republicans have really done a lot over the last 10, 12, even 15 years to basically say they're the batshit crazy party. So, you know, congratulations, Democrats, I guess. Unforced errors on their side might give us the presidency. Who knows? We'll see. All right, thank you all very much. I wanted to look into this YouGov poll. Make sure to go ahead and subscribe. Become a member if you want to. Have a wonderful day wherever it is you are. Bye-bye.